Hello and welcome to the Cannabis Education Center at Holyoke Community College. I'm Sage, the instructor of the cannabis cultivation part of our program. Today we are going to be looking at some basic math procedures for cannabis growing. Many students, when they start out, are overwhelmed by math and find it overly complicated. But there are some simple procedures that we'll need to know to be good cannabis growers. And I'm going to take you through some of those today. Math is important for farming and growing cannabis because farmers need to calculate things like germination rate. They need to be able to determine how much fertilizer and pesticides to use. Inventory of farm equipment, grow room equipment, and even plants in a grow room will require some basic math skills. And a cost-benefit analysis of a growing operation is always important so that a grower can understand how much money they're making based on the inputs they're putting in. Now, we're not going to focus too much on cost-benefit analysis. If you're working at a cannabis facility, there are people who look at that. But if you're doing your own growing operation, it's good to keep track of how much money you're spending versus how much money you're making or saving for growing your cannabis. So that's always helpful to have so that you're not putting too many inputs in something that you're not getting out the money. Before we get into the math procedures, I want to talk about units of measurement. So you'll make measurements, and then it's always important to have a unit or a label, as some people say. So if you're measuring weight or mass, technically they're two different things, but for us they'll be the same. You may use units like grams or kilograms. A kilogram is 1,000 grams. You may use ounces or pounds. There are 16 ounces in a pound. So we have some metric measurements here. Grams and kilograms are metric. Ounces and pounds are using an English system. And sometimes you'll see things measured in grams and kilograms, sometimes ounces and pounds. And cannabis can be sold in grams and ounces. So it's important to get an understanding of how they relate to one another. A gram is a tiny amount. It's about the weight of a paperclip, whereas an ounce is quite a bit heavier. It is about 28 grams in an ounce. So imagine like 28 paperclips there. Part of a pound. Volume is the amount of space something takes up. So in metric, we use liters and milliliters. You could even use cubic centimeters, cubic liters. In the English system, we're more familiar with cups, teaspoons. There are volume ounces and pints. So those can be used and are used in different ways in different growing operations. Sometimes I see fertilizer amounts in milliliters. Sometimes I see them in teaspoons. Temperature can be either Celsius or Fahrenheit. Most often we use Fahrenheit. It is actually a more specific measurement, unit of measurement. So a Fahrenheit degree is much smaller than a Celsius degree, so it's more accurate. However, around the world, people use Celsius. Around the world, people use the metric system. So you might see things in metric. Length and distance, basically the same thing here. In the metric system, we use meters and millimeters, centimeters, some of you may be familiar with. Micrometers, now I mentioned micrometers, that's a teeny tiny distance. So that's 1/1000th of a millimeter, and it's microscopic. However, you might use micrometers to measure things like trichomes. Other types of measurement in English, we use inches and feet and yards. Now, don't memorize all the conversions going from, say, meters to feet or grams to pounds. There are apps for that, and so utilize them. You don't look dumb. You look like you're using your resources, let me tell you. Occasionally, there will be some unit conversions going from one to the other that you use a lot. And so those might just stick in your memory and they might be helpful to memorize. For me, I use distance a lot in my work. And so centimeters to inches, I have memorized that conversion. there are 2.54 centimeters in an inch. I just know that off the top of my head. So when I see those comparisons, I could visualize it in my mind. Apps are particularly helpful with temperature because the conversion for that is a little complicated. Okay, so let's look at some procedures here. Percents, how to calculate percents. This is important for a variety of reasons, and we're going to look at germination rate. So a way to think of percent is what you have divided the total possible amount of what you could have times 100. So an example of this is when a farmer plants 20 seeds, say, and only 18 of them sprout. We want to know the percent of plants that sprouted. This gives us the germination rate. And so we can compare germination rate for different varieties. We can compare germination rate under different environmental conditions, and this could help us to be better growers. So in this case, we have 18 as what we have, divided by 20, what was possible, times 100, and that gives us 90%. So in this example, we have a 90% germination rate. Germination rate can vary depending on the batch of seeds that you're using, or, like I said, environmental conditions. So it's important to keep track of it and record your germination rates. A quick check. What's the germination rate for a farm where 500 seeds were planted and only 456 sprouted? Wow, that's a lot of cannabis plants. So take a second, pause the video, and do this math problem. So I like to think of this, what do we have? We have 456. What we could have had was 500. So we put 456 over 500 and multiply by 100, and we get 91.2, so slightly better germination rate. Now, percentages are also used on bags of fertilizer in a different way. So fertilizer amounts are another application for math in growing cannabis. Whether you're growing cannabis or tomatoes, you're most likely going to use some kind of fertilizer. And a fertilizer bag or container usually has 3 numbers on the front. This one has big bold letters 10, 30, and 20. What does that mean? These refer to the percents of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the fertilizer. So this has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. We abbreviate those words with NPK. Those elements have their elemental symbols. You'll see that different fertilizers have different numbers on the bags, and they're used for different things. So fertilizer that's higher in nitrogen is usually better for growing. Potassium and phosphorus are better at different stages of the plant life cycle. More on that when we get to growing and fertilizer amounts. So these are just showing some different bags of fertilizer that you might see around there. It can be a little bit overwhelming. What do you use? When? Well, we'll get there, like I said. But we want to maybe determine how much fertilizer is in a bag. So maybe we need a certain amount of nitrogen for our plants, or potassium or phosphorus. So to determine the actual amount of each nutrient in the bag of fertilizer, you multiply, the multiplication here, the weight of the bag by the percentage of the nutrient in decimal form. Okay, so to determine the actual nitrogen content in a 100-pound bag of, say, 1926-5 starter fertilizer. First, what I would do is consider the percentage of the nutrient and make it into decimal form. So I'm looking for nitrogen here. Nitrogen will always be the first number. It's always in the same order, NPK. So there's 19% nitrogen. In decimal form, that's 0.19. And we always move the decimal point over 2 spots to the left if we're looking at a solid whole number. We have a 100-pound bag here, so this is going to be easy. 100 pounds times 0.19 the percentage of nitrogen, equals 19 pounds of actual fertilizer material. Now, here's a quick check for you. How much potassium is in the previous bag? Remember, the numbers are in the order NPK, and we're looking at potassium, which has K. We're looking at the 5 there. So the 5 in percent form, the decimal would be after the 5. We move it over 2 spots to the left to get it into its decimal form. 0.05 would be the percentage if we wanted to do that. So 0.05 times 100 would be 5 pounds. Another place where you may need to use math is in inventorying a grow room. So for this, you might be asked to use spreadsheets and tally up amounts in your spreadsheet. Excel is a commonly used program for making spreadsheets, and it's fairly easy to use. There are many types of tutorials on how to use Excel and the functions of Excel. It can add columns up for you. It can add rows up for you. You can insert different types of formulas into your cells in Excel, which is really great. And all of that information, how to do that, can be found online. There are other YouTube videos for that, and I encourage you to look them up if you're going to use Excel. However, depending on where you work, your company may have their own inventory software. So whatever you use, please get familiar with how to use it. You don't want to look silly. Do all your research, figure out the software, all its bells and whistles, and most likely it will be doing a lot of the math for you. So I hope that helps with some of the basic math procedures that you will use in growing cannabis. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email at sfranetovich@hcc.edu.